Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College in Bayside, New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event is entitled Contain and Control, the American Obsession with the Black Body, and features our guest speaker, Dr. Agnieszka Tuzyńska. This event is part of the KHC's 2020-21 National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium entitled Internment and Resistance, Confronting Mass Detention and Dehumanization. Today's event is presented in partnership with the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center. It's also connected to our new virtual exhibition, The Concentration Camps, Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide. The exhibit surveys the scope and brutality of the Nazis' extensive network of ghettos, transit camps, women's camps, forced labor camps, and extermination camps. These camps played a central role in the Holocaust, the annihilation of 6 million Jewish people, as well as the mass murder of millions more, including Polish people, Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, people with disabilities, social outcasts, Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as other political and religious opponents. You can find more information about the exhibit in the chat. After the presentation, we'll have some time to answer a few questions, so please be sure to submit them via the Q&A feature on your screen, as we've disabled the chat for security purposes. Today's moderator is Dr. Susan Jacobowitz, Professor of English here at QCC and one of this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows. She has published and presented on second-generation literature, graphic texts and performance art, Australian Jewish and immigrant writing, the conflicts and challenges of post-war Jewish identity, and teaching the Holocaust and genocide. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobowitz.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being able to be involved in the event and having this opportunity to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Tuzyńska. Dr. Agnieszka Tuzyńska is an associate professor of English at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. She teaches African American literature and writing. She also volunteers as an educator in prisons and jails, teaching college prep workshops and facilitating book discussion groups. Her research focuses on African American literature of the Jim Crow era and the Harlem Renaissance, and prison literature. Her work has previously appeared in journals such as Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the United States and Dialogues in Social Justice, as well as others. And her upcoming essays on two African American authors, Claude McKay and Willard Motley, will be published respectively in the College Language Association Journal and English Language Notes. So thank you so much, Dr. Tuzyńska, for agreeing to be part of this event, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to everybody at the center for having me. And thank you to everybody who is listening right now. Let me just switch to the presentation. I want to open this presentation with the image of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. When I visited the memorial in June 2019, I was undone by its central display of 800 hanging blocks, but also by a quotation from Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, engraved on the wall at the exit, which reads, all my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck unnoosed and straight, so love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts, that they just as soon slop for hogs, you gotta love them. The dark, dark liver, love it, and the beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now, love your heart, for this is the price. This quotation insists that the visitors to the site hold the bodily dimension of the Black experience in America in their minds, that they sit with that thought. And a similar insistence runs through the text of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Coates points out that in the US, the language around the subject of race, such as race relations, racial justice, or even white supremacy, all of it actually serves to obscure, quote, that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. So if we, especially those of us who are not Black, want to think about racism in America, we cannot allow ourselves to look away from that bodily experience. Ta-Nehisi Coates also says that in America, it is traditional to destroy the Black body, its heritage, he writes. And looking at the history of slavery's cruelties, the Jim Crow era lynchings, and the modern day permissibility of extrajudicial killing and maiming of Black Americans, that certainly appears to be the case. But I also think that the destruction of the Black body in America has been a means to ultimately another goal, another end. It seems to me that the ultimate goal of anti-Black racism in America has been control and exploitation of the Black body, and as a raw resource, and that inflicting seemingly irreparable damage as well as destruction are tools of terror and domination to help achieve that goal. But here's the question: how can this level of violence, control, and exploitation be aimed at a segment of the population in a country that prides itself on the ideals of democracy and equality, without literally the whole nation revolting against it? The answer, I think, lies in the ways that the treatment of Black Americans has been normalized to the rest of America. Americans as a collective, including those of us who don't consider ourselves as racist, have been socialized to see the injustices inflicted on our Black fellow Americans as part of how America functions, how things are. We could view it as a sort of national implicit collective, national collective case of implicit bias. This normalization of systemic oppression of one segment of the population is, of course, not unique to America. The most obvious example of it is the Nazi Germany and other places under the Nazi control. Only, of course, as some of my remarks later will indicate, we should remember that it was American racism that was an inspiration for the Nazis and not the other way around. Because of this connection, it is not incidental, I think, that the Memorial for Peace and Justice was in part inspired by Berlin's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, known as the Holocaust Memorial. So how can this kind of collective implicit bias be generated in a society? Physical violence always goes hand in hand with symbolic and representational violence. Barack Obama acknowledged this fact when, in 2016, addressing a town hall on race relations in the United States in Washington, D.C., he said, "What is true for me is true for a lot of African-American men. There's a greater presumption of dangerousness that arises from the social and cultural perceptions that have been fed to folks for a long time." Social and cultural perceptions, he says. So what I offer here today is an overview of the history of the kind of images and ideas about the Black body in America, in American culture, that have been fed to Americans from slavery to the present, to show how those ideas and representations have worked to legitimize control over, violence against, and exploitation of Black Americans. One more thing to keep in mind is that, as Coates and others have pointed out, race is not real in that it has no meaning in and of its own. Racism is a social practice. Race emerges through the rituals of racism, as Barbara Fields and Karen Fields explain in their book, Racecraft. So in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, race is the child of racism, not the father. So the kinds of images I'm about to discuss are part of how race is made real through racist depictions, through racist practices. In other words, cultural and literary representations matter. They shape our consciousness and ideas about the world and one another. That explains why the cultural domain, the artists, was the first domain from which Jews were expelled in Nazi Germany. And it also explains why in May 1933, the Nazis ritualistically burned 25,000 books in Berlin, because in order to normalize persecution, you must affect the culture. While most of my examples come from the late 18th century until the present, it's important to step back a little bit further in history, just for a moment, to what could be called the era of pre-scientific racism between 15th and 18th centuries. When Europeans came into contact with African people, the physical body immediately captured their imagination. They could not explain the bodily differences in skin, color, hair, and shape. Yet some of the most enduring and harmful racist stereotypes date to that period, such as the comparison of people of African descent to apes. And it really is a very enduring, lingering metaphor. As late as 1906, the New York Zoological Society, which is now the Bronx Zoo, had a monkey exhibit featuring a chimpanzee and a man from Africa, whose name was Ota Benga. And even today, I think this ape metaphor is unfortunately very well alive and well. So already these very first encounters produced this idea about the animal-like or not quite human nature of Black people. That's also linked to ideas about Black sexuality. To Europeans, African scant clothing was an indication of lewdness, and African tribal dances were expressions of uncontrolled sexual lust. And from the start, this animalization of the Black body has had idiosyncratically harmful implications for Black women. The Black female body early on becomes trapped in this impossible paradox of being rendered simultaneously as animal-like, naturally promiscuous, and deviant in its sexuality, while at the same time being repulsive, grotesque, and spectacle-like. European ideas about feminine beauty did not apply to Black women. And these two axes of dehumanization meet in the story of Sarah Baartman, also known as the Hottentot Venus. She was a Khoikhoi woman who was born in 1789 in South Africa, orphaned at a young age, and then brought to Europe in seemingly false pretenses by a Dutch doctor, and later exhibited as a freak with an animal trainer across Britain. She would be objectified and caricatured. In 1814, she was taken to France and became the object of scientific and medical research. And after her death in 1815, at a young age, her body was dissected and her brain, skeleton, and sexual organs remained on display in a Paris museum until 1974. Although Sarah Baartman's story does not involve the American continent, it continues to haunt modern-day ideas about the integrity of Black women's bodies and Black women's rights to dignity and agency. But to justify slavery as an institution for centuries, animal metaphors were not going to be sufficient. The paradox of slavery is that in order to enslave someone, while you are denying their humanity, you also have to recognize it first. That's why we don't talk about enslaving mules, right, or cattle. So it's kind of a paradoxical concept. So what is needed is a set of representations to legitimize the institution of slavery and exploitation of slave labor, while also easing the white conscience. The dominant caricatures of Black people during slavery are very pragmatic. They portray Black people as childlike, blissfully ignorant, docile, harmless, and content with their condition as slaves. If, for example, slaves are childlike, then it is morally acceptable to have an institution, slavery, that takes care of them. One cultural form originating at that time was popularized by that popularizes these portrayals of Blackness as buffoonery and ignorance is blackface, a performance that generally used white actors wearing Black makeup to portray Black people as grotesque with exaggerated features and their life as messy and comedic. One of the most popular performers was Thomas D. Rice. He is known to be the father of minstrelsy and is credited with popularizing the blackface character of Jim Crow, whose name would later become synonymous with the era of segregation. Sadly, some stereotypes of Blackness were perpetuated by opponents of slavery, which is a statement, I think, to these images' power. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, by the way, Hitler loved, was written by an abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in 1852. And these images of Black docility and loyalty continued to be circulated during the Jim Crow era as part of the nostalgia for the Old South. For example, in Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell from 1936, we definitely see that. And by the way, even in 2014, a poll showed that it was Americans' second all-time favorite book behind the Bible. 3 years later, the book was turned into a movie, and one huge fan of the movie was Adolf Hitler. Even though biology doesn't really emerge as a coherent field until the 19th century, and the pioneering works of scientific racism would not be written until a few decades later, some, like the founding father and slave owner Thomas Jefferson, were drawing connections between the physical body and intellectual abilities and morality before then. In his writing, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson describes physical differences as the basis for the hierarchy of races. He says the difference is fixed in nature. And he later writes, besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less hair on the face and body. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. This greater degree of transpiration renders them more tolerant of heat and less so of cold than the whites. They seem to require less sleep. It appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites. In reason, much inferior, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. They are more ardent after the female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. So for Jefferson, the bodily difference can be used to conclude that Black people are more durable, less intelligent and less creative, and capable only of lust and not love. We see here the seeds of racist ideologies that the 19th century science would solidify as the basis of racial superiority and inferiority. It's also hard not to mention, while talking about Jefferson, his female slave, Sally Hemings. Hemings has been sometimes referred to as Jefferson's concubine or mistress. But I think it's important to point out that first and foremost, she was his property. And ideas about Black women's sexual deviance and availability of their bodies made enslaved women sexually vulnerable to their owners and other white men. It also nullified their reproductive rights, as producing more slaves was assumed to be part of their job. And it's important to mention that Sally Hemings mothered 6 of Jefferson's children. So the idea that unlike white women, Black women are not delicate meant that their labor could be exploited. And Jefferson notes, right, that slaves, that their bodies can withstand more, right? And also the Hottentot Venus, whom I mentioned earlier, when she was displayed on the stage, she was being poked and probed. Her body was actually being assaulted. So that, plus the idea that Black women's bodies are usable raw materials, also translated into their availability for medical research. In 1845 to 1849, for 4 years, Dr. J. Marion Sims conducted gynecological experiments on 12 enslaved women who were brought to him by their owners with a condition known as vesicovaginal fistulas. And he performed dozens of surgeries on them without anesthesia. I also will mention here that Sims was a good friend of P.T. Barnum and a huge fan of circus, and the use of Black bodies in circus by P.T. Barnum has also been written about. This is just one example of experimentation on slaves, not the only one. There was also a study on how much heat slaves can withstand. I can talk about this maybe in the Q&A. And in general, Black bodies used as medical guinea pigs continued way beyond slavery and really continues until today. Modern medicine really wouldn't be possible the way we know it without a series of abuses and exploitations of Black bodies and other vulnerable bodies. So the real breakthrough in racial thought really comes with 19th century science. Anthropology, biology, and medicine, they all explore the physical difference, and they conclude that the physical body makes race real, and that the idea that races have a hierarchy is provable. So by the end of the 19th century, there is scarcely a body part that hasn't been probed and explored and written about. And physicians are the ones who are at the forefront of all of that. So one very central figure in all of this is Samuel Morton, who writes this work, Crania Americana. And part of what he does there is examine skulls of people of different races, and it leads him to the conclusion about their intellectual abilities. And he's just one example among many. These writings just explode. There's so many of them. And all these ideas work to justify slavery. But once slavery is over in 1865, a new set of ideas will be needed to legitimize the new forms of control and exploitation. Black poet and essayist Sterling Brown writes in 1933 that the old stereotype of the docile slave started changing during the Reconstruction era, when, quote, many white writers argued that without slavery, which supposedly suppressed their animalistic tendencies, Blacks were reverting to criminal savagery. So with the shift from slavery to Jim Crow also comes a shift from images of Black people as submissive slaves to brutes and monsters. Science will be used to lend legitimacy to these ideas of innate aggressiveness and criminality and to justify punishment for it. Statistician Frederick Hoffman in 1896 writes about that Black people, when they were slaves, were, quote, healthy in body and cheerful in mind. But 30 years later, he says, the 1890 census indicates the gradual extinction of Black people due to, quote, natural immoralities and propensity for diseases. I said earlier that all these representations and ideas serve the purpose of justifying different ways of controlling and exploiting the bodies of Black people. As the popular depictions start changing during Reconstruction, we also see a new phenomenon in the field of criminal legal system, and I purposefully refuse to refer to it as the criminal justice system. In the late 1860s, so after emancipation, Southern states start passing Black codes, laws passed on state and local levels to restrict the civil rights and civil liberties of Black people. So now Black people are being imprisoned for offenses such as loitering, vagrancy, or not carrying a proof of employment. And for the first time in American history, many Southern prisons now incarcerated more Black prisoners than white. So these prisons start leasing convicts. They call them convicts, not my language, convicts to plantations and industries, which formerly profited from the free labor of slaves. So basically the manipulation of the loophole in the 13th Amendment allows for a new way to exploit Black people's bodies and labor. Prisoners in these convict lease systems were used to do railroad construction, cut timber, or do plantation work. Rare surviving convict leasing records show 25 to 30% mortality rate, doubtlessly due to hard work and often dangerous work and being subjected to physical punishment and severe deprivation. Black codes ensured the constant supply of prisoners, so there was no incentive to care for the health of incarcerated laborers. Meanwhile, the belief that freed Black people were a peril continues into the early 1900s through the writing of multiple scientists and other writers. In 1901, author Francis Keller cites statistics about crime and Black people. The Negro element is the most criminal of our population, more criminal as a free man than he was as a slave. In 1916, a eugenicist and lawyer, Madison Grant, writes in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, the intelligence and ability of a colored person are in pretty direct proportion to the amount of white blood he has. And, it's really in these, in 20th century, early 20th century biology, anthropology, and medicine that these ideologies of Jim Crow meet Nazism. And it's most evident in the eugenics movement, of which the United States was the leader. It was not a fringe movement. It was at the center of the intellectual life in the United States. And the United States, the American sterilization program, forced sterilization program, was very inspirational to the Nazis. In these images and stories, this animalistic Black monster, his most common crime is a rape on a white woman. These new ideas are being used to justify new forms of subjugation, such as lynching. Equal Justice Initiative documented 4,084 lynchings in 12,000 states between the end of Reconstruction and 1950, and more than 300 lynchings in other states during that period. While rape and other crimes were sometimes offered as reasons for lynching, very often there was no stated reason. There didn't need to be a stated reason. In reality, lynching was used as, quote, a tactic for maintaining racial control by victimizing the entire African American community, not merely punishment of an alleged perpetrator for a crime. That's from Equal Justice Initiative. Literature of the time fed this image of the Black peril as well. For example, Thomas Dixon's 1905 novel, The Klansman, an historic romance of the Ku Klux Klan, portrayed a Black man as a threat to white womanhood. In the novel, the white woman is saved by the KKK. When this book was turned into a film in 1915, titled The Birth of a Nation, it was hugely popular and got a special screening at the White House at the invitation of President Wilson. Also, politicians are using this image of the Black monster to oppose anti-lynching laws. For example, Representative Sisson in Mississippi said, quote, "As long as rape continues, lynching will continue. We are going to protect our girls and women folk from these Black brutes," end quote. Of course, it didn't matter that most of the time there had been no rape. As with slavery, so with Jim Crow legislation, there is this commitment to legitimizing new racist practices as the old ones become less usable. Painting, my apologies for the cap. Painting images of Black people as criminals allowed for even the greatest cruelties against them to appear as somehow still congruent with America's democratic ideals. And I would argue that it's still the case. American racism, and especially its legislation aimed at Black people, made the United States very attractive to another country working on its own racist legislature, Nazi Germany. The Nazis were especially impressed with the American success in establishing a second-class citizenship status for Black Americans and other people of color, and with anti-miscegenation laws. This book is very useful. I recommend it to anyone who would like to learn more about this topic. The Nazis saw clear parallels between their own ideology and the Jim Crow America, especially the South. But it was not mutual. Southerners and Americans in general saw Nazi Germany as the leading country in oppressing its minorities, and they saw the United States as its opposite, which I would say indicates clearly a poor introspection on their part. However, Black newspapers absolutely did see the parallels and pointed them out very, very often. Starting in 1933, as they worked on the Nuremberg race laws, the Nazis started to study American racism very closely. They were more interested in American laws as a model worthy of scrutiny than in the practice of lynching. They understood lynching and they understood the impulses behind the practice, but they disliked the mob and the chaotic element of it. They saw it as a spontaneous type of violence and were critical of the disorderly character of it. They, of course, underestimated the role of the state and local governments in enabling racism, lynching. While the Nazis were confused by America's proclamations of egalitarianism, they admired the way the United States managed to control and suppress their freed slaves. Hitler praised America in Mein Kampf as the one country that managed to establish the kind of racist order that Germany aspired to. The elements of American race law that they were most inspired by were anti-miscegenation laws. As they were working on their own laws against sexual mixing between Jews and non-Jews, the Nazis looked for an example and found one in America, the one place where interracial sexual mixing had been criminalized. The Nazis faced the problem of defining Jewishness in racial terms in order to formulate their own blood law. They were fascinated by the American one-drop rule, but most thought that it was too harsh. Only the most radical Nazis supported that measure. For most Nazis, that American one-drop rule was simply too far, going too far. But what they found very helpful was the open-endedness of American laws and the fact that such laws could be executed, enforced without precision and definitions. So let me just make a little bit of a leap. Earlier, I mentioned the convict leasing system. Eventually, Southern states stopped leasing out their convict laborers. But convict leasing is replaced by another form of labor, prison labor, the chain gang. Until 1940s, individual counties retained the right to use chain gang prisoners for public works. As with convict lease system, most of the chain gang laborers were African American. For them, the only difference was that they now became essentially slaves to the state rather than an individual. They were put to various kinds of work, including road construction, ditch digging, and farming, while cuffed together at the ankle in small groups. Death rate among chain gang prisoners was 15 to 25%. So we see the criminal legal system taking new measures to control and profit from Black bodies. And the sort of imagery and ideas circulated in both scientific circles and general public legitimize both lynching terror and these new and changing forms of detention. What we see in the 1940s and 1950s is that there's an increased criticism of lynching as a practice that undermines America's international image. The American criminal legal system responds with a new form of terror to this development. As Equal Justice Initiative argues, lynchings give ways to executions. Brian Stevenson calls the death penalty lynching's stepchild. He says it's no accident that the states with the highest lynching rates are the ones with the highest execution rates today. 2/3 of people executed in 1930s were Black, and the trend continues. By 1950, African Americans made up 22% of the South's entire population, but 75% of people executed. African Americans make up 42% of people on death row, and 34% of those executed, but only 13% of the population is Black today. Stevenson also notes there is no sense that this has, on a large scale, undermined most Americans' perception of their society as a free and just society. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s caused many Americans, white Americans, to question how they viewed Black people. As opposed to just caricatures and degrading images of Blackness, television and newspapers were now showing Black protesters, including children, being beaten by police, arrested, and jailed. So the stereotype of the fiendish Black monster, brute, lost much of its effectiveness because it was becoming very clear that it was Black Americans who were often the victims. Lynchings did not stop completely, but they decreased dramatically and became something done in secrecy, not as community events as before. But the second half of the 20th century develops its own version of the Black stereotype, which will be used to justify violence and exploitation. What we see, especially in the 1980s, is the passage of stricter sentencing guidelines in prison and the expansion of the war on drug, leading to American prison population to explode. Elected officials start using the slogan "tough on crime," and their go-to image is a newly remade Black brute who now shapeshifts into the Black thug. George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign used what is now known as the Willie Horton ad, in which a Black prisoner's image and the story of his violent crimes were used alongside criticism of Bush's opponents' soft on crime policies. The ad only featured a single Black man, but it subliminally associated Blackness with criminality and solidified that image. Other politicians since 1980s have also used this trope of the thug, right? And the media has helped normalize it. In the 1980s and 1990s, cinema and television villains are often Black. They rob, rape, and murder without remorse. They tote guns and are often gangbangers. We see this on television shows like Law and Order and NYPD Blue, and on unbelievably 32 seasons of the infamous series Cops. These images and ideas are incredibly powerful. They are affecting us as we speak. Recently, researchers studying implicit bias carried by ordinary Americans found, for example, that news crime stories with darker-skinned suspects elicit more worry about the crime than stories with white suspects. The cost of these new ideas about Blackness is, of course, human dignity and human life, and that's the reason why I'm showing the Central Park Five, now Central Park Exonerated, and Donald Trump's call open letter in which he calls for their killing. We now know that they were innocent. Today, the media continues to participate in demonizing Black Americans, even in the form of posthumous coverage of their deaths at the hands of police officers. They do so while invoking those stereotypes, the modern brute, the thug, and by linking the victims' physical bodies to perceived danger. In a 2018 article examines newspaper reports following the police killings of several unarmed Black boys and men, and the authors discuss the killers and the media's focus on Black bodies, on these victims' Black bodies, their physical appearance, and how they were linked to perception of danger. Here's a quotation from a news story after Michael Brown's killing by a Ferguson police officer, Darren Wilson. This is from a newspaper. Brown certainly was a giant, as surveillance footage seems to prove, showing his 6'4", nearly 300-pound self towering over a petrified convenience store employee who got manhandled and intimidated. And then Officer Darren Wilson's, the killer's, description of Michael Brown in an interview is really telling as well. When I grabbed him, the only way I can describe is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. And then after he did that, he looked up at me and had this most intense aggressive face. The only way I can describe it is it looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked. This is just one example, but the authors conclude that these men and boys are posthumously portrayed as thugs, and their bodies, as well as their perceived threat that they pose, are used to justify their deaths, absolving the actual killers of the responsibility. And this image of Black people as dangerous also brings us to the current era of mass incarceration. And I'm going to just give a few statistics and finish with that. Everything I just talked about lands us here at the door of the prison industrial system complex and its insatiable consumption of Black bodies. The United States is the world's leader in incarceration. There are 2.2 million people in American prisons and jails, a 500% increase over the last 40 years, despite increasing evidence that large-scale incarceration is not an effective means of achieving public safety. This increase in incarceration does not correspond to increase in crime rates, but to changes in law and policy. A century ago, a Black man was four times as likely as a white man to be incarcerated. In 1980, at the peak of the war on drugs, he was 11 times as likely. Black men and women are also jailed at triple the rate of white men and women, and nearly half of all people serving life sentences are Black. Racially biased law enforcement is one reason. For example, the majority of people stopped in New York City's stop and frisk program were Black. Black men and women are also far more likely to be victims of police use of force. 13 states in the United States have no minimum age for trying children as adults. Children as young as 8 have been prosecuted as adults. Some states set the minimum at age 10, 12, or 13. Only in 2005 did the US Supreme Court rule that the death by execution is unconstitutional for juveniles. Before the ruling, 365 children had been legally executed in the United States, including 22 since 1985. That makes it about one a year. Only as late as 2010 did the court declare that life without parole sentences could no longer be imposed on juveniles convicted of non-homicide offenses. International law does not allow life sentences for children. The United States is the only country in the world that sentences juveniles to life in prison without parole. Equal Justice Initiative has identified 73 people who are serving sentences to die in prison for crimes they committed when they were 13 or 14. Of the 73 children identified, nearly half are African American. All of the children condemned to death in prison for non-homicide offenses are children of color. By way of conclusion, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, Black life is cheap, but in America, Black bodies are a natural resource of incomparable value. I think we see it in slaves' physical labor and the reproductive rights of women being exploited. We see it in experimentation where the bodies of Black people are used as raw material to ensure medical advancements of which they will rarely be beneficiaries. We see it in convict leasing, chain gangs, and the modern day prison industrial complex, where prisoners' work is exploited. Coates also notes, America understands itself as God's handiwork, but the Black body is the clearest evidence that America is the work of men. He further writes, America believes itself exceptional, the greatest and noblest nation ever to exist. He responds with a challenge. I propose, he says, subjecting our country to an exceptional moral standard. These remarks from Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, put a long overdue pressure on us to remake America in the image that aspires to. Where do we start? Perhaps by emphatically placing the current position of Black Americans within the context of this manufactured, willful, designed cycle of exploitation and control by manipulating the image of Blackness in the white mind, and by rejecting that distorted image, and by deferring to Black Americans when they themselves tell us what it's like to be Black in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think that I'm so glad that we were able to do it. You know, I think that this historical moment is just really the time when this is so relevant. And I'm sure that listening to your presentation, people have a lot of questions. So if people want to start, you know, sending their questions for you, then you can start responding to them. But I think, you know, if maybe I can start with one that when you were speaking about Willie Horton and that kind of appeal to the suburbs, or the, you know, the fear maybe in the suburbs of attack by this sort of, you know, brutal image. I think that we saw that over the summer too, with this real appeal to the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And is there any reason, you know, do you have any idea about maybe why it sort of didn't work this time? You know, what has changed now so that it wasn't an effective kind of tactic to try to get everybody in the suburbs afraid of diversity?
Actually, I kind of recall some of the conversations I've had with you as a friend, not a panelist, and you know, some of the remarks you made about the place where you even live is that the suburbs have changed. America has changed, right? And we are really way on the way to becoming a majority-minority country, and the suburbs are not white the way they used to be. So I think this idea that you can scare all the white suburbanites by telling them that people of color are going to move in is just not going to work. We are a much more diversified nation at this point. So it just doesn't have the same ring to it.
We have a question.
But I absolutely agree that it was, it echoed exactly the same sentiments. The language was similar. Yeah,
it's kind of a proven tactic. One of the questions that has come in is similar. It says, I would love a clearer elaboration on the idea of race being non-existent and how the concept of race was made to target marginalized communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you know, actually Toni Morrison talked about it as well in interviews. It's this idea that race, I sometimes use my own example, you know, as someone who grew up in a very racially homogeneous place, Poland, where everybody seems to be white, but you don't think of yourself as white. Whiteness doesn't mean anything. At the time when I was growing up in Poland, whiteness didn't mean anything because you have to have something else. It has to be put in relation with something, and there has to be power associated with it in order for it to gain meaning. It's really about power. And so when there is not this relationship of power, race in and of itself doesn't really mean much. It's only when these different practices, this exercise of racism starts acting on people, and on the relationships one another, and on how institutions give them or deny them access, then all of a sudden race becomes something that matters, right? Because it bars people from opportunities and equal participation in society. But without that, you know, it was actually interesting. I think Nazi serologists and also American scientists, they were annoyed, they were frustrated by the fact that they couldn't find anything in the blood that would confirm the difference, right? That there is really something real about race. And so they retained this idea of blood as a metaphor. And it's actually very convincing. People still today talk about how, oh, I have German blood, or I have, Cherokee blood. There is nothing in the blood, right? It's literally just a metaphor. But even now in 2020, we don't remember that it's a metaphor. That's how successful it is. But that's how strongly they just wanted to show that there's something embedded in the body that made race real, when that's actually not really the case. We now know from biology that, the makeup of people could be much greater, the differences could be much greater across completely different types of difference than racial difference, right, than between racial groups. So it's really power and what we do, right? What do we do with these images? What kind of ideas do they build in our minds, and how do we act out on other people, what we've learned from them? Yeah.
This is more of a comment, but also interesting. Black imagery is so hypocritical, scared of the Black person walking in your neighborhood, but honoring the sports figures for how they perform, but do not dare allow them to kneel during the national anthem.
It's such an excellent comment. Yeah, and you see it, I didn't include all of these examples, but even in the 1990s, there are these recordings of sports commentators comparing athletes who were not really comparing, not explicitly comparing, but making comments about white players on a basketball team as being smart, right? Like, he's playing smart, and then his African-American opponents would be athletically gifted, right? So it's this exploitation, right? I mean, sports definitely, I think, participates in this idea of exploitation, right, of the body. I'm so glad that I didn't give it this example, so I'm so glad that someone else did. And I know that the football scene has been compared to sort of like a modern gladiator ring, right, where it's just this consumption of entertainment without any concern for the lives, the embodied, right, lived experience of the people who play.
This is something you mentioned, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I think this might be something that comes into play. The fusion of Christianity and a character like Uncle Tom. But there's a question here that says, "Please tie the current fervor of many white evangelical Christians for Donald Trump with the idea of Black bodies, and where might this put Black Christians and other Christians of color, in your opinion?"
I will honestly say I'm drawing a blank here. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, but it's just, I'll admit that I actually don't know much about religion in general and the different denominations in particular. I don't understand, because it really kind of calls into question what the basis for these communities is, right? And the stated bonds, right, that bring people into these churches seem to be very different from what is exhibited in election results and voting records. I think it's just the power of whiteness in general, that there's something about whiteness that is just such a, as David Roediger, historian, called it, there's these wages of whiteness, what that buys you, even if you have nothing else going for you, that really seems to bind people together. And I can't think of anything else really. But again, I'm not by any means an expert on white evangelicals, so I don't really know. I wish, if someone else has an answer, I would love it, because it's something that I've asked myself a lot too.
Kind of interesting thinking about the conflicts between someone like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, like the part that religion plays in the kind of resistance to certain kinds of systemic racism. I think that was
absolutely. I mean, the Black church, right, has really been a very different type of communal space, right, in comparison to what was just mentioned. It has really always been, even before it was established as such, religion has been a place of sort of finding ways of mutual support and powering through and resisting the order, right? It's mind-boggling how the same general idea can lead people in very different directions. So. Mm-hmm.
Before one last question that Laura's going to ask for us, there was one question I saw where someone was asking you how you got interested in this kind of work, or what drew you to this kind of work.
So I'm going to try to avoid too long of an autobiographical story, but I lived in Poland, right, as a child and young woman, and like I said, it's a very white place even now still. But I pretty early on became interested. I was always interested in social difference, other types of social difference, class-based, sexuality-based, and someone gave me a book to read. I was already studying English and I was pretty fluent in it. So I read, I think Toni Morrison's Beloved, actually, from which I quoted today, was the first one that opened something in me. And then I read Richard Wright's Native Son, which, I continue to say that kind of felt like a train hit me. I felt just really compelled by it. And so I knew that I wanted to study African-American literature and move to the United States to do that. And then another sort of event in my life that kind of consolidated my interest was that I started volunteering, teaching in a prison in Illinois, in central Illinois. And all of this kind of seemed to make sense altogether. The more I learned about America and what America is and what, this whole business of whiteness is and what race is, these different strands of my life all of a sudden were not different from each other. They kind of made sense together. So yeah, thank you for asking that. And if I may do a pitch, I'm going to be teaching a class, if there are any students in the crowd, in the spring, I'll be teaching a class that will bring together these histories of slavery and Jim Crow and the history of the Nazi Germany and the Holocaust in Europe. So if anybody is interested in these parallels and similarities, but also differences and gray areas, I would love to have students who enjoy reading and thoughtful discussions. So please, it's listed as Holocaust as under the English department's listings, Holocaust literature.
Yeah, there's a question also about what are the challenges of teaching students about this in today's climate. I think this historical moment made this session something really important and something that we're going to connect to our classes and use in our teaching. But maybe you can talk about what some of the challenges are.
I think, to be completely honest, in some ways, not always, but in some ways, I found it a little bit more challenging. I was here for the George W. Bush era, and so I was starting to teach at that time. And I lived in the Midwest and taught in the Midwest for many years. And it's very different in many different ways. I feel like our students at City University of New York feel deeply. Many of these issues just really fall so close. And so the challenge doesn't come from students not believing that there is racism, or, you don't have to explain to our students, I think, that racism exists or discrimination exists. The challenge comes with making sure that we can inform, or I can inform and teach and educate without sounding like there is no hope. Without sounding like we can kind of all close shop because it's never going to change, right? I very much resist this idea that America is all about progress and look how far we've come. I think we see day in and day out that we haven't come nearly as far as we would hope. But at the same time, I would never want my students to walk away from learning about this history thinking that there's just never going to be any change, right? And so what I try to hope to think about is how, telling students that forms of resistance have always been there. And whatever progress it does exist, it's only because of that resistance, right? And so coming together in solidarity and kind of actively opposing these systems, today's systems of oppression, is really how we not become defeatist. But that, I think, is the greatest challenge, is just not wanting the students to feel like it kind of it's a vicious circle. Mm-hmm.
We're so grateful to the Kupferberg Center. Maybe we can defer to Laura.
Thank you so much. Yes.
We're so grateful for you to present today. And I think what's been really important, and as we've been looking at the questions coming in, I think for you to talk and how you have talked about your own personal experience in Poland, looking at notions and definitions and myths around race in a homogenized society, and what happens when that's put in opposition. It's something that we very much talk a lot about in our exhibition at the KHC. And I also wanted to let people know, we will put in the chat in a moment information on our new exhibition, as well as the link to Queensborough Community College for more information on spring courses, including the one Dr. Tuzhinska just mentioned. And I just wanted to ask one question just in terms of framing. And as I'm about to ask this question, it just came in. What do you think we can do to change for the better?
It's very interesting to me that I get this question quite often, both from my students at Queensborough and my students at prisons and jails. And I always say to them, you are the vanguard. You have no idea how much power you have if you come together to change this, because I am, despite my status as a woman and an immigrant, I'm still, I think, in such a privileged position in so many ways in this country. But people who have really felt the brunt of this, if we all come together, I think I really see solidarity, sort of intersectional movement as a way to move forward. But also just in my own experience, I just going through the pandemic and thinking about all of this, it can be so difficult, right, to feel like we really can't do anything. So setting smaller goals, maybe you can't abolish the prison system by next week. But maybe you can do something smaller that will chip away at the system in smaller ways, right? So, I mean, for me, going in and teaching at prisons and jails is such a thing. I can't do it right now. There's obviously a lockdown. But there are other ways, right? Like you can support other organizations in your communities, local organizations in your communities that bring people together for the shared beliefs in fighting white supremacy, not just the kind that says, I'm not racist, but and if you don't find one, establish one. If your neighborhood doesn't have an anti-racist group that is interested in thinking through ideas of white supremacy and fighting them and action against it, maybe you're the person who should set up a group like that. And bring people together. And it's amazing what several minds put together can do, and several bodies also, right? Sort of creating this front. Because it's a very lonely, it's a very alienating and painful feeling to think that nothing can be done. It's about opening yourself up to other people who might feel the same way and doing things together. And of course, education, right? I take that for granted, that, what we do in the educational system, which in many ways has really miseducated over decades and centuries people. I think it's really important how we use that space to tell the truth.
And as you're talking that, I wanted to also in the chat, we've put materials on anti-racism education that you can find online. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Tuzhinska, we really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's participated today. We hope you stay safe and healthy during these chaotic times. And for more information, please go to our website. Thanks very much. Be well.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.